Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Cast. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined alongside by my partner, Bruce. Bruce, how are you doing today?
Very well. Looking forward to this conversation.
So I'm actually pretty excited about this conversation because, um, as I was telling him before we started recording, I had just finished reading Ben Burgis's book on Christopher Hitchens on, why he matters, what he got wrong, or what he got right. And, I think I gave it a positive review. I thought it was informative. I thought it was well argued at parts, even though I did find it very disagreeable. And I had just finished reading that book, and then I started to move on to another book that had just recently come out about how Hitchens can save the left, which is kind of basically a much different analysis of Christopher Hitchens, and I think a much more favorable one, and I would argue a much more agreeable one. And so we're lucky to be joined by the author of the book, Matt Johnson, who's a writer at Quillette, at The Bulwark, Haaretz, Arc Digital, and Aereo Magazine. So, Mr. Johnson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and as I said, I'm glad you're here. I've always been a fan of Christopher Hitchens because I've really always just admired his style of argumentation and how witty and his just encyclopedic knowledge of pretty much anything that you ask him. So I've always admired him for that, even if I did find some of his points to be unconvincing. I always thought that I don't want to say contrarianism, because I think that gives off the wrong impression that he just kind of picked positions for the sake of being a contrarian. But he always defended his positions regardless of what anybody else would think and regardless of what public opinion would state. And what I always find interesting, and I love asking people this question because I think it's just, people tend to have a different answer, is that, Christopher Hitchens towards the end of his life, he really took some unorthodox positions. The Iraq War is an obvious one that we'll be discussing, but also even bigger ones like, criticizing the people who were mourning Princess Diana after she passed away. That one was explosive as well. And, a lot of people know him for his stance on religion, but religion was really just kind of one of the last things that he spoke about. He had a long journey before then. But even though a lot of people kind of view him as falling off towards the end, and a lot of people vehemently disagree with his positions on religion and on foreign policy, he's still kind of revered in a sense, and he's still remembered. We still have books coming out about him. We still have a lot of compilation videos coming out about him. So how is he someone who is just so well remembered, and people still think about him? People still ask themselves, what would Hitchens say in this situation? What do you think is the reasoning behind, Hitchens' lasting legacy?
To start with a word that you probably rightly discarded, contrarianism. Hitchens definitely took some positions that were extremely controversial, particularly in his last 10 years. And I think that's one of the reasons why he stands out in our memory. His position on God was sort of part of the spate of atheist books and arguments that started gaining momentum in the mid-aughts. But he'd already come out in support of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq earlier in the century, and that was the sort of thing that made him persona non grata on the left. And it was interesting for a lot of people to see this former Marxist, well, he always claimed to think like a Marxist, but former socialist, endorsing those wars, and in such unequivocal tones. I mean, a lot of the supporters of those wars started to back away from them when they went south, and Hitchens never did. So he was already such a controversial and such a public figure. He was on Bill Maher, and he was on Fox News, and he was on every network. He was on C-SPAN a million times. So those are some of the reasons why he was just in the public imagination and in the public sphere in such a bombastic way. But what you said about how he just stands out for his eloquence and the ferocity of his polemics and of his presence on the debate stage and in the studio and pretty much anywhere where he was communicating, either with the pen or with speech. He was just such a powerful communicator. And I think that's why there's this huge compendium of what are now called Hitch slaps on YouTube. And you can just find these going back to the 80s, debates that he was taking part in, which is the moral system, socialism or capitalism. I mean, that all the way up through his polemic about Henry Kissinger at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, and then straight through his arguments about God and Iraq and everything else. So yeah, as you noted, he also wrote about Mother Teresa and Princess Diana. He went after these icons intentionally because he was a very iconoclastic figure. But contrarianism is one of those words that it's kind of a mixed bag. I think there was an element of that to his personality. I do think that he went after these targets because they were beloved in some cases, or because some liberal consensus had formed around them. But at the same time, I think that they were extensions of a core set of principles that he had held consistently throughout his life. And he actually said in discussions about his book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, the title of which he despised, that there doesn't seem to be a good word in our political vernacular for the sort of stuff that he does. He always thought dissident was it was a term of honor that one had to earn by actually resisting a despotic system, which Hitchens never had to do because he lived in the United States and he lived in Britain before that. And then he said terms like gadfly or maverick were just insulting and condescending. So his publisher landed on contrarian, but Hitchens never liked the word very much. But anyway, we can get into all those tensions and talk about anything, foreign policy, God, whatever.
The idea, I think, from a lot of people on the left is that Hitch kind of took a strange turn, right? And specifically, this was in terms of the Iraq War. They would ask questions: how can a Trotskyist socialist somehow go from criticizing government interference and criticizing American militarism versus just defending the Iraq War, and not just that, but continuously, defending it in other instances? And so a lot of people view this as a kind of just complete divergence from what he originally believed. And, as Ben Burgess wrote in his book, what the hell happened? But the argument could be made that, well, actually, if you look at the situation, or if you look at Hitchens from just recognizing that he kind of prioritized his principles and his values first, specific values, the transaction actually kind of makes sense, and it's pretty consistent. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on the values that he held, and what were the values that he held that kind of allowed for this transition to make sense?
Yeah, I can speak about that broadly, but there's this particular instance that I would draw your watchers' attention to. Hitchens was out promoting his book on Kissinger, which as solid and lacerating a compendium of American war crimes, follies as you can possibly imagine. And he was on C-SPAN, something like, just look at what the United States is doing in Iraq right now with the sanctions. It needs to Hitler or something, with some idiotic moral equivalency. And Hitchens just in his tracks. Saddam Hussein is everything that is said about him. He could have the sanctions. Would simply open up the relevant sites to UN inspectors if he would stop functioning single norm and custom of the international system. But he chooses not to do that. I mean, this guy is a totalitarian monster. And this was something that Hitchens knew intimately. A lot of time in Iraqi Kurdistan, and this is long before his support of either the war in Iraq. So Hitchens was well aware of just how depraved that regime was. And same reason that he called for accountability for Kissinger, ability for Saddam Hussein in 2003. I mean, there's a fairly direct connection. You just can't operate outside, commit war crimes on a vast scale. I'm not actually comparing Kissinger to Saddam Hussein, and I'm just saying it was interesting that this was before 9/11. Hitchens opposed the Gulf War. And even if you did oppose the Gulf War, sanctions on Iraq, or anything else about U.S. foreign policy at the time, you could still declare straightforward and non-obscurantist way, this is what we're dealing with. And he was willing to do that. So I think that connection is very clear. He believed that NATO should intervene and prevent Slobodan Milosevic from ethnically cleansing and dominating and taking over the entire country. Left could not be bothered to support that position. They couldn't even be bothered to argue in favor of the lift and strike policy that the Clinton administration was considering before. The possibility of putting NATO aircraft in the air was even conceivable. So this this is just a pretty straightforward connection, and he was evolving this position on Afghanistan and the support for universal human rights and the support for some semblance of. So I think there is a pretty clear connection there.
Matt, I'm not as familiar with Hitchens as some other people who I greatly respect, but I've come across enough of his work and seen enough of his interviews to be fairly knowledgeable about, I believe, the principles behind his stances. Now, he was very aware of what would be called wokeism today on the left. When I think there's a quote attributed to him. Taking a jab at quote unquote liberals who cry when they're hurt, like the whole insistence behind identity politics that is going on now today, and he also didn't pull any punches when it came to criticizing Islam, when everyone thought it was only kosher to criticize Christianity. Now, no one can predict the future, and there are many people who are pulled towards the center left and center right today because of what we're presented with on the political stage, with very unappetizing options like wokeism and Trumpism. Now, would he have stayed left, in your opinion? He defended Salman Rushdie when almost no one else would, and he criticized Islam in a time where it was absolutely taboo to do so. Now, these areas are fundamentally in line with human rights. They would have been originally considered left, but now because of the Twilight Zone we live in an area where now things like free speech and applying consistent principled criticism to aggressive cultures around the world is now considered right. Now, would he have supported a demagogue like Trump, a woke regressive like Biden, or would he have taken up or try to pull for a third option? What's your take on this?
So some people have suggested that he would have been a Trump supporter, and their argument basically, Hitchens was critical of Islam, Trump was critical of Islam, full stop. Hitchens was a lot more prescient about and populist authoritarianism than I think a lot of people realize. Throughout the 90s, like Jörg Haider, whose FPO in Austria won a very substantial late 1990s, and Hitchens was basically arguing that this new kind of friendly right was using these oleaginous arguments to convince people that they were respectable when making some very nativistic and very ugly old arguments. So I'm not saying that post-right in Britain or in the United States are fascists or anything like that. But at the same time, this idea that Hitchens would have just signed on to Trumpism because he was Unitarian or because he was critical of Islam doesn't stand up to any element of the historical critics or criticisms of Islam. You'll find that they were always that the Muslim world is not this single cohesive whole. All Muslims are not interchangeable in Hitchens' mind. 99% of Iraqi Kurds are, the Bosnians that Hitchens was arguing in favor of defending in the mid 90s, Muslim. And so it's just this idea that Islam is just this, which is what Trump would present. I mean, when Trump wanted to ban all Muslims from the country, or when he wanted mosques, when he wanted to do these deeply illiberal and authoritarian things, he was treating Islam as just this one gigantic sort of blob, and historical and frankly stupid. And this is just a mistake Hitchens never would have made. That's just one of many ways in which he would have seen Trump's version of politics as deeply demagogic. I mean, Trump said states should have just taken the oil in Iraq. And that's something he said repeatedly during the primaries. And then election in 2016, he said, just take the oil. Why didn't we take the oil? I mean, hold the Iraq and take the oil. Can you imagine what Christopher Hitchens would have had to say about that? I mean, it confirms all theories of the pseudo anti-imperialist left. It confirms every last ounce anybody has ever had about U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War.
One of the thought experiments that I've often given myself is, if Sam Harris had passed away around the same time that Hitchens did, people could just as easy, I think actually people could even more easily make the argument that Sam Harris would have supported Trump. given the fact that Sam wasn't, as socialist as Hitchens was, and that clearly isn't the case. And I think it's also just very surface level to think that Hitchens would have voted for Trump just because of his view on Islam. And as you said, Hitchens' view on Islam wasn't basically this monolithic, Muslim ban kind of view that Donald Trump had. It was a lot more nuanced, and he always recognized that there's a difference, there's a distinction to make between Muslims and Islam. I mean, he was on Palestine's side, basically, and so yeah, I've never understood that.
Well, I mean, there is one sort of complicating factor, which is the existence of Hillary Clinton, which would have horrified Hitchens that it was Trump versus Clinton. I could have seen him maybe just sitting that one out. I mean, Hitchens had certainly demonstrated a willingness to support third-party candidates in the past. Or at the very least, he thought there should be a third-party alternative to the two-party duopoly. He might have changed that position later on, given the shift in political circumstances. But there's a famous picture of him standing in front of this giant debate Nader sign, He was actually pals with Nader. It's kind of a fun fact. Apparently, Nader offered him a largish sum of money, in his words, to quit smoking at one point, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, yes, I do think that he would have recognized the clear and present danger that is Trump. I really do think he would have seen it. And yeah, I mean, you can look at Harris as some sort of correlate, though. Hitchens is more politically complex, I suppose I would say. I mean, Harris is more of a philosopher than a polemicist or an essay.
Yeah, one of the things that we kind of alluded to previously is the fact that Hitchens took on many positions that were very, very unpopular. And not just unpopular, but he also trespassed on certain taboos in terms of just common courtesy. So, the main thing that I remember is the Princess Diana issue that occurred, where a lot of people were arguing not so much that Hitchens shouldn't be saying these things about a person, but rather that he shouldn't be saying this so close to her time of death that it was in poor taste. You saw a lot of people also get this accusation recently when Queen Elizabeth died, and then, Cosmic Skeptic, I think, it was this YouTuber, waited 2 weeks, and then he uploaded a video why he didn't think that the monarchy should continue, that it should basically be abolished. And I think this is different from Christopher's stance on freedom of speech, which is one of the many things that I really like about him that he said. He echoed a lot of what Orwell said about, censorship isn't necessarily just state-sponsored. It's not necessarily imposed on you by governments, but it can also be self-imposed by society, where people kind of don't really want to say certain things or publicize certain things because they're scared of being ostracized from their communities, or let's say they also have some financial incentives to say certain things. He was also against that level of censorship. But this one, and you could make the argument that it's kind of the same thing. You shouldn't censor yourself no matter what. And that's kind of the thing that I go back and forth on, right? Where, on the one hand, I think you should be able to say whatever you want, regardless of what other people are going to say. And you shouldn't censor your opinions by any stretch of the imagination for the sake of preserving some people's sensibilities. While I also recognize that, it could be viewed in bad taste if you criticize someone right after they pass away. And also, just pragmatically, people will probably just kind of brush you off as a contrarian or really not take you seriously, just kind of view you as being edgy for the sake of being edgy and not actually listen to your arguments because of it. So I kind of go back and forth on this, and I don't really know what side to take. I mean, what are your thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, it's an interesting lead-in to his position on free expression because, as you note, I actually open the first chapter, which is First Amendment absolutism. It's the chapter on free speech, with this essay that Orwell had written. It was originally supposed to be an introduction to Animal Farm, but it was ironically suppressed, and it wasn't published with the original version. And in it, he makes the case that censorship is this very pernicious force. It doesn't have to be imposed from the top down. And this is consistent with a lot of arguments that Orwell made about how, totalitarianism can creep in anywhere, and you shouldn't get complacent even if you live in a Western democracy. I mean, incidentally, that's why he called the party Ingsoc in 1984, and he had to constantly fend off accusations that he was saying English socialism was the path to totalitarianism, which he obviously was not saying because he was an English socialist. But what he was saying was that we have to be on guard against these tendencies all the time, whether we live in democracies or not. And yeah, self-censorship was a very big issue for Orwell, just as it was for Hitchens. And I think one of the reasons why Hitchens made the arguments he made about Princess Diana and about Mother Teresa is the fact that, and he made them when he made them, after they would pass away, he was the master of the counter obituary. He would always be the person who'd go on the news and say, a lot of what's being said and written about this person is tripe. They weren't so great, and here are the reasons why. But, beyond just the sort of contrarian instinct he may have had that may have led him to do that, I think he really did find it alarming how this sort of herd mentality would set in when a prominent public figure like that would die, especially one who is very beloved, as both Mother Teresa and Princess Diana were. And so I do think that a lot of self-censorship did kick in. A lot of defense mechanisms kicked in. And he was always going out of his way to challenge what he regarded as any sort of dogma or any sort of just congealed consensus. And that's just a theme throughout his work from the very beginning. You could tell that he didn't really like being on anybody's side. I mean, he really didn't have a problem flipping off the audience at Bill Maher's show, for example, or calling out people who agreed with him about Iraq. The second you'd start talking about religion, the agreement would suddenly come to an end. There's actually this great story about Hitchens at I think it's like an American Enterprise Institute event, where he was surrounded by these sort of overeager young Republican types. And they were talking about Iraq, and they all agreed, the United States has to have a robust presence in the world, particularly the Middle East, all this stuff. And then they started talking about God, and these guys just kind of like shriveled up and wandered off. And, so it's just, I think he really got a kick out of that all the time. And that is consistent with his wariness of self-censorship and the sort of constant temptation to shut up when you think it would be convenient to do so.
Well, he wasn't anything if not principled. That's remarkable about him. Now, I know Hitchens mostly through his association with the New Atheists. Everyone knows he was a fierce critic of religion, and my views on religion largely parallels that of Sam Harris and of Hitchens himself. And while I myself remain convinced that religion is dogmatic, it can skew people's actions and beliefs towards irrationality. I personally still have the stance that religion still offers a sense of structure and ritual, that it really does provide some kind of scaffolding to the modern world that secular society has not managed to replace effectively. I just returned from a special multi-ethnic delegation trip to Israel, and what I saw there in the culture, in some gatherings I attended, has really cemented this view in my mind. And how do I want to ask this? We get people like Douglas Murray claim that the West is losing confidence in its own values, and because there's no central identity to claim. And what do you think Christopher Hitchens would have made of this? He was a criticism of religion for the reasons I stated above, but the role that it fills in providing a sense of structure and community, that is something I don't believe has secular society has managed to replace in any way, shape, or form effectively, and we're paying the consequences of it in today's society. Like, what would his views have been regarding identity and a sense of shared values in a nation?
Yeah, well, Hitchens did always make the case that religion is ineradicable. He didn't think that we could actually supersede it or completely transcend it. This was an argument he made from the very beginning. He thought it was ineradicable for wholesale bad reasons, and I would be more sympathetic to the argument he made there. that it has some social utility. It can certainly have a cohesive effect on the body politic or on families or on larger groups. But at the same time, people like Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson and many of these sort of strange Christian hybrid types who say, I can't bring myself to believe in Christianity myself, but it's got such boundless social utility and it's so vital to the fabric of Western civilization that we simply must keep it around and we simply must cherish it and embrace it. I do have to say that my patience with that view has frayed over the years, because they often move from that position to a much more offensive and, to my mind, much less substantiated view that, had we taken on atheism, or if we do become a more atheistic society, then we're just on the path to totalitarianism. Nazism is right around the corner. And that's a position that I don't think is defensible. There are too many secularists throughout history. There are too many genuine atheists throughout history who manage to maintain a commitment to pluralism and liberalism. And it seems to me insulting and condescending to assume that this is just this inescapable end of the road for any atheist. So I always take it quite personally when I hear Jordan Peterson saying, Nazism is the final stop on the rail line that you happen to be on. I find it it is ahistorical, because while you can make the argument that Stalinism was quite irreligious, making the argument that Germany during World War II was some bastion of atheism is just nonsense. Most, the members of the SS and just the Nazi Party more broadly were practicing Catholics and Protestants. It was a very, and Jordan Peterson was like, they couldn't possibly be Christians because of what they were doing. Well, is Jordan Peterson the ultimate arbiter of what Christians are allowed to do and not allowed to do, of what real Christianity is and isn't? Have many crimes, and Hitchens would always point out that, many crimes have been justified in the name of God, and the Nazis did so, the Confederacy did so. So it's just, I can see the argument you're making about how there is this religious impulse and it can manifest itself in many unhealthy ways. I've actually become more sensitive to and sympathetic to that view as well. So in John McWhorter's new book, Woke Racism, he talks about how he thinks this sort of identitarian shift in our civil society is something emanating from a religious impulse. Like, people are starting to act with a religious fervor. You'll see these really self-flagellating episodes. The example that I keep bringing up in podcasts, just because it's seared on my memory, was the group of white citizens of some town who were kneeling before their black neighbors, and they're doing this to atone for past injustices. And I have to tell you, I think group guilt is ugly. It's actually the root of bigotry. It's the root of prejudice. And when you see people acting like that in this really masochistic and self-flagellating way, you do see the sort of haunting echoes of religion. So I think you could be onto something, or, the Douglas Murrays of the world could certainly be onto something when they say, now that we've killed God, to paraphrase Nietzsche, we're onto these other things to worship. And that does seem conceivable to me. But at the same time, I think secularization has occurred, certainly across the West. And I don't think that there's just this latent, ambient level of religiosity that will always be with us no matter what until the end of time. I think actual secularization is possible. Sorry, that was kind of long-winded, but, it's a very nuanced question.
Yeah, a lot of people can look at a title, how Hitchens can save the left, particularly, people who would consider themselves progressives, who watch David Pakman or Sam Cedar consistently. And almost invariably, whenever, they listen to critiques of the left from people like Ben Shapiro or Candace Owens, or, even to center-right people or moderates, they always say, well, what do you mean by the left, right? It's just such, they'll accuse kind of the Candace Owens of the world of just characterizing the left as just this, the crazies on the left, like the really far left people, as if that kind of as if they speak for the left, right? And so a lot of people can look at the title and just kind of brush it off as, oh, that's probably written by a Ben Shapiro fan or something like that, right? So what do you refer to specifically when you're talking about the left in this book?
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. I'm glad you brought it up. But it goes back to the conversation we had about Islam earlier. I mean, the left is as fractious and fissile as any religion. In fact, it probably more so. But it's also true that right now there are elements of the left that are actually stacking up very well by my lights. You know, the German Green Party was in support of sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine before more mainstream German politicians were in favor of doing so, and certainly before leaders in Europe and the United States wanted to do so. And the Green Party was, 20 years ago was just almost isolationist. I mean, it was deeply committed to pacifism, which has been part of German political culture since World War II. So that's just one example. And as critical as I am of Ben Burgis's politics, I actually think when it comes to free speech on campus, when it comes to identity politics, focusing on class and on socioeconomic factors instead of obsessively focusing on identity, I think Burgis scores really highly on all those fronts, and he's a really sharp guy and a great debater, and that's so it's important to make that distinction. It's not like the entire left is captured by any of these things. The reason why I address the book to the left is because Hitchens' tradition is left-wing. I mean, even when he was supporting intervention in the Balkans, and even when he was supporting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we can get into if you'd like to, I think he was doing so for left-wing reasons. I mean, he was doing so because he believed in universal human rights and human dignity. He was doing so because he was an internationalist at his core. There was a debate in the mid '80s in which I mentioned it earlier in this podcast, in which Hitchens was arguing, making the case for socialism versus capitalism, and he opens with just what sounds like strict humanism. I mean, for like 5 of his 6 core points are like, we're all members of the same human family. The distinctions, racial, sexual distinctions, should be consigned to history as soon as possible. There is no God. That was another thing he pointed out. And it's all these arguments that he didn't really get into economics for the entire opening statement. And I think that's because these other values, such as internationalism, were operating on his hard drive then, just as they are or were at the end of his life or in the last 2 decades of his life. So, and there are still some people on the left who embrace those values. But yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I'm sure a lot of people have looked at the title of the book and thought that it was kind of a Shapiro-esque, because it's just gotten to the point now where you listen to somebody like Shapiro, or you listen to Tucker Carlson or any of these figures, and they just say the left does X, the left does Y. I mean, could anything be more idiotic? At least when I paint with a broad brush and talk about the populist authoritarian right, I am pointing to specific figures. I am pointing to Trump. I am pointing to Orban. I like to at least, but there's just this kind of, that's the thing. They're trying to present the left as this amorphous whole because it's much easier to knock down that straw man than to engage with all these nuances and all these details. So yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing it up, because I don't want people to think this is some broadside against the left, because, by the way, I wouldn't be interested in quote unquote saving the left unless I consider myself somebody who's on the left. And I will also just have to say that I think the biggest political threat that we face today is actually the one emanating from right-wing nationalist authoritarianism. And I think the left needs to be in a stronger position to resist it. And that's really the only reason I wrote the book.
I want to push back on that just a little bit with my next question, and I say that as someone who generally who leans center left in my politics. But in recent years, I'm much more centrist than I was before. As I said earlier, I was recently a part of a recent trip to Israel as part of a multi-ethnic delegation, and one of the things I saw there was the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, and one of the things that was really put center stage when we were going through the entire tour was that how the entire world turned a blind eye to the Holocaust, and how many world leaders, including President Roosevelt himself, absolutely refused to step in to act because of realpolitik. There are opportunities, I believe, to bomb railways leading to Auschwitz, and that just didn't happen. Now, to be fair, in defense of the West, that people like General Eisenhower saw what was happening when they finally came into Germany and told his photographers and every reporter he could find, saying, "Hey, photograph all of this, report all of this. If you don't do it in 10 years, no one will believe it had happened." So props to Eisenhower. He made the world aware of the human rights atrocities that were going on. what does this have to do with the subject at hand? Well, Hitchens was a proponent for the Iraq War, and because of the human rights abuses under Saddam Hussein's regime, and all that came out through Kenan Makia, who people call the Alexander Solzhenitsyn of Iraq. Nick Cohen details his own activities in the book What's Left, but yet you see a lot of left wingers oppose the Iraq War, and one of the things that I think is a turnoff of today's modern left with it's such a narrow focus on human rights. You hear the phrase "never again" chanted over and over and over. Yet I think it's become a useless virtue signaling phrase that has lost any substance. But when you come around to Christopher Hitchens, when I hear "never again," and I don't think I've ever heard him say the phrase. I can see him saying that and meaning it with the consistency of his actions, and he was really committed to universal human rights values, and that's something I feel that the left, as a whole, has dropped, has completely betrayed in that circumstance. Now, would Hitch have seen things from that angle? Would he seen I'm not saying he would have joined the right. Don't get me wrong. But I divorce the left from liberalism nowadays. I don't think the left is liberal any more than the right is. And one of the reasons I believe this is the case is I believe because of regressive identity politics and because how the left seems to have taken a view on human rights similar to what Noam Chomsky thinks. The left has betrayed its values and its commitment to universal human rights. Now, would Hitchens have stayed left with that backdrop?
Yeah, well, I think in one sense he did move toward the center. I mean, this is something that, because I mean he would always say I'm just as radical as I was, and he did officially abandon socialism. He thought it was no longer viable as a political movement and economic alternative around the world. So he just moved on from socialism in that sense. And then he used to really despise the word liberal. He used to think it was evasive. He thought it didn't really capture much, and it was just kind of spongy and spineless. And it wasn't until his last 10 years that he really started arguing in favor of liberal democracy as an end in itself. I mean, this was, you can see this coursing through works like his book on Thomas Jefferson. You can certainly see it as a theme in Letters to a Young Contrarian. And then, by the time he's writing the introduction to his very last compendium of essays, arguably, he actually says explicitly that there are two major camps on the left, in his view. One is the anti-imperialist left, and one is the anti-totalitarian left. And he says he moved toward the latter. So he still did regard himself as somebody who was on the left at the end of his life. I think that distinction is probably well worth bearing in mind, just because if you look at the left's, and again, I mean, I have to say the left sometimes, just because shorthand is unavoidable. But I mean, the elements of the left that Hitchens was critical of, they didn't come out in support of Bosnia in the middle 90s. They were just eager to get the United States out of Iraq as quickly as possible at the end of the Gulf War. One thing that Hitchens said he found despicable about the left, and this is just a couple of years after the end of the Gulf War, which he opposed. He was actually deeply opposed to the Gulf War, which he saw as this extension of typical American realpolitik in the region. He said that the left's indifference to the war once it was over. They weren't talking about, the massacre of Kurdish and Shia rebels in Iraq who were being killed in their tens of thousands after the war. I mean, they weren't calling for the United States to help these people, to help them overthrow Saddam Hussein or assist them in any way. I mean, he said he thought that was a stain on the record of the anti-war movement. So, I mean, this is, again, this goes way back for Hitchens. But to get back to your core point, I mean, I did try to enforce some of the distinctions on the left today. I mean, you could say that the left has abandoned liberalism, but I would say maybe you could make that argument half the time with Ben Burgess, and then the other half, when he's arguing in favor of free speech, robust exchanges of ideas on campus and elsewhere, you'd have to say that he's defending liberalism. And then you could say the same for, the people who, even just in the Democratic Party in the United States, who are in favor of defending Ukraine from a Russian onslaught. Those people are on the left, nominally on the left, and they appear to be taking the right line on Ukraine. And I mentioned the German Green Party, and there are many other examples of left-wingers today who aren't, they're not reactionary, or they're not, what's the word that became so popular, regressive. And I think that's always worth bearing in mind, because I also wouldn't say that the right is completely lost to Trumpism or something. I mean, there's so many people on the right who I still admire. David Frum, for example. And there are lots of, I write for The Bulwark, which is sort of a center-right publication, but, it's just kind of a centrist thing. But it's, a lot of, Bill Kristol had a hand in creating it, and he used to write for the Weekly Standard, which a lot of people regarded as this neocon rag, but The Bulwark publishes really great work from Kathy Young and from all these people. Bill Kristol publishes great stuff. I mean, I know that people like Robert Wright, for example, say, beware of sort of aligning with neocons in the fight against Trump, because eventually they'll convince you to invade Iran or something. And I just don't see that as something that's going to be happening in the near future. I don't think Bill Kristol is going to be making the case for an invasion of Iran. And I do think that resisting Trumpism is important. And if you can do that in a bipartisan way, you definitely should. Just to close off one thing that I meant to mention earlier, when Vincent, when you said that Hitchens was sort of on the side of the Palestinians, I mean, to some extent that was true. I mean, he got into an argument with Andrew Sullivan on C-SPAN, and this was after 9/11, and it's after his sort of turn toward neoconservatism, if you insist. I mean, I don't actually think that's a fair way to put it, but that's how people would put it. And he was arguing with Sullivan about Israel, and he was just making a much more liberal, conventionally left-wing case that the Palestinians are oppressed, and that Israel wasn't living up to its own liberal values. So that was the argument that they had. But then at the same time, I mean, Hitchens was just relentless in his criticism of Hamas, and he said one of the worst political developments in his lifetime was the shift from a more secular PLO and more secular leadership in Palestine to a much more theocratic one. And he would always point out things like the fact that Hamas's charter contains references to, like, glowing references to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it's just full of anti-Semitic garbage and propaganda. So I think that was a fairly liberal balance to strike, where he's critical of Israel, but at the same time he recognizes that Israel faces a sleepless threat from one of the most totalitarian organizations on earth. So I do think that these were fairly consistently liberal positions, and he just didn't shy away from that word liberal as much in his last 10 years, because I think he started to see more threats forming, more threats to liberalism.
Yeah, I've always liked that, and you write about this in your book, that he recognized that the left really kind of just took on this anti-imperialist view almost as a religion, where it didn't really matter what the circumstances were, any level of intervention, there was this knee-jerk reaction against it. And there's no circumstance in history in which America should have ever interfered, right? In Kosovo and Bosnia, like, it doesn't matter. All the problems kind of ultimately tie back to the United States. And, this was one of the things that Hitchens kind of became critical of some of the things that Chomsky said, where Chomsky was basically, the person who kind of really popularized this very staunch, or I could be wrong about this, but I kind of always associate Chomsky as the one who popularized this very staunch anti-imperialist, anti-America kind of view, that because Hitchens really was, principles first, values first, he didn't take that, he didn't take a lot of those positions, whereas the anti-imperialist view, that came first. And almost as if it was a creed, it was a religion. And, one of the things that I think is great about Hitchens is that he kind of was just an iconoclast in every sense. He killed every sacred cow no matter what. And in a way, even though, you could view what he said about Princess Diana or Mother Teresa or even God as grotesquely offensive, and even if you can find it completely disagreeable, I will always admire the fact that he is making sure, or at least he's helping to make sure, that there are no taboos in society, where everything should be open to discussion, everything should be open to free inquiry. And that's one of the many values I think that Hitchens professed that the left can learn from him, that I think a lot of people on the left have kind of forgotten and kind of just don't really abide by, even though they were the original arbiters of those values in the first place.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that there are actually a lot of people on the right now that have taken a very Chomskyan line. I mean, I don't know if you remember that this is recent and it's in keeping with other things Trump has said, but he said something like, this is a matter of months ago. He said there's this fiction that's allowed itself to form in the United States that our biggest enemy is Vladimir Putin. No, our biggest enemy is us. It's the deep state. It's the people who don't think Donald Trump won in 2020. And he's, when he was talking to Bill O'Reilly years ago, and O'Reilly said, Putin's a killer, Putin's a thug. Trump said, we have a lot of killers and thugs. You think our country's so innocent. And obviously, to just head off any criticism I can see forming in the minds of some listeners, yes, the United States has a horrendous record around the world in many places. I mean, just ask any Chilean, the overthrow of Allende was a horrific denial of democratic sovereignty. The United States supported Saddam Hussein as he waged a pointless 8-year attrition war in Iran. And the United States has done all of these horrible things. So all that aside, the main point that I'm trying to get across to people is just the fact that if you always find your way to a criticism of the West, or to a criticism of NATO, or to a criticism of the United States, then you're adopting what Michael Walzer calls the default position of far too much of the left on foreign policy. It's a position that doesn't engage with geopolitical reality. It doesn't engage with the fact that we face real threats around the world, that the United States can actually serve as a backstop and a guarantor of security around huge swaths of the world. We still have tens of thousands of troops in East Asia, and the United States support to Ukraine now is pivotal. It's critical. It's just this automatic inward search for guilt, and this Hitchens often uses the word masochism in his last 10 years because there was a lot of it floating around. People would say, after September 11th, Oliver Stone described it as the revolt of September 11th, and Hitchens just stopped him. They were actually on a panel together, and he said, "Excuse me, revolt? It was state-sponsored mass murder using civilians as missiles." This is the sort of moral clarity we need. We really do need it. After the invasion of Ukraine, the Democratic Socialists of America released a statement in which they said, the war's bad and everything, Putin's bad. There's just kind of the throat clearing that, of course, they were going to give you. And then they said, but what we really need to do is look at the root cause of this war, which is NATO's warmongering. And it's just this endless, boring refrain from so much of the left. You just get so sick of it. And I just think that Hitchens is a good, robust rejoinder to that, because I do think that he supported certain elements of U.S. foreign policy for demonstrably liberal reasons. And I think that's just it's a good thing to remember that these, and yeah, I think a lot of the left is actually passing that test right now, thankfully.
Yeah, well, I think this is a good place to end it. We're coming up on the hour now. Mr. Johnson, it's been great to be able to speak with you, and I highly recommend everyone check out the book. It's fantastic, and it's very detailed. It's very in depth. There's a lot of footnotes to it, so I highly recommend people give it a read, if just for the sake of gaining some pretty good insight into the mind of Christopher Hitchens and the oppositional view of what has pretty much become kind of commonplace now. So, Mr. Johnson, thank you so much. And where can people find you?
You can find me all over the place. I publish in The Bulwark, Quillette, Haaretz, Aereo Magazine, just a bunch of places. And I'm on Twitter at MattJJ89. And yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great day.